once we arrived in El Salvador, of course it was raining. We actually were getting there at the kind of end of the rainy season. And so we, get off the plane, and people had told me like the humidity was going to, hit you, and it was going to be really humid, you're going to be sweaty. And so I got off, we were in the terminal, and I was just like, it's a little humid, but not bad. I mean, they're just, being wimps or whatever, that was my thought process. And so, we got our bags, and I remember we were just walking out, and the automatic doors just opened, and there it was, just, the humidity. And I was just like, I knew exactly what they were talking about then. I was just, you were just hit with it, and then you just immediately started to sweat. And, we're all in our suits here, and I'm thrilled to be there. I'm really excited to be there, but I'm like sweating like a dog here. That's one thing about El Salvador, is that you'll always be sweating. You'll constantly be sweating. The only time I really wasn't was maybe in the middle of the night, early in the morning. My first area was a small town called Nahuizalco, which was a small town located in the state of Sonsonate. And that was definitely very different from the city, because it was very rural. Most people did either farming, or they would often harvest coffee. Coffee is a really big thing in El Salvador, and a lot of people would go and just harvest coffee for a few months out of the year, probably from late December to February. Just very humble conditions a lot of the time. That was one big contrast that I saw, was that when I arrived, this was my first area, and so a lot of people would be living in, if they weren't living in the main part of the city or the town, they would be, of course, living on the outsides, and most of them would be living in just the corrugated, steel tin roofs, and they'd build their own little huts out of just this, just the corrugated steel, and they'd, find old, trees and, put them as supports, everything like that. So very, very humble conditions, I would say. And just with a regular dirt floor, that's a common thing, in El Salvador, just those huts. And, very kind people, as far as just like, of course you can tell they're just, their living conditions are just very humble. They'd always invite us in, and they'd offer, us something to drink or something like that. And so that was a great experience. It was very different, and people would often make their own, what they would call colonias, which would just be streets. Sometimes they'd make their own path somewhere, and it was just over time, people would just build along their little huts along these streets. There was one particular, I guess you could say, like little type of canyon area that they had made, where it was built by the people. They'd build their own stairs and out of the dirt, and sometimes they'd get concrete every once in a while. But you'd hike up there, and you just find little huts along the way, and you just keep going. It surprised me that people, could live that way, and also was a very humbling experience, like, just to see, I grew up with a flush toilet and everything like that, whereas there, that's not all that common. They would, dig their own latrines and everything like that, but at the same time, they could still be very gracious and very kind, especially towards, an American like me. I kind of stick out like a sore thumb, because I definitely have my white skin and everything, but and they, based upon television, everything, what they see, the living conditions are a lot different, and so even though they can see where I'm come from, they would often offer me what would be their meal for the day. That was very humbling, and that made me feel very loved. So that kind of, faith as well as kindness was very impactful towards me. And I learned to, greatly, receive that food, and made sure, you eat all of it and everything like that. That's something that they're very satisfied to see, because if you, eat every last bite of it, they see that as something that, oh, you know what, they loved it, and they're very gracious for it. There was one part of this small town that was far off, and it was dirt road. Everyone there made baskets. I think it was just because they had really easy access to the bamboo that was there, and they would just all the time, we would be walking down the street and everybody would just be, with their knives, making these little strands from the long bamboo sticks to weave baskets. And they would get really quick at it. They'd just be really fast. That was something that's interesting, and as a lot of the times there, they would make their own merchandise to sell because there really wasn't anything else, and so a lot of people would be doing that to sell in the larger cities or something like that. They would often travel to the larger cities to sell them because it wasn't that common, because everyone there would be making these baskets to sell, and so they would have to spread out to go find people that would be willing to buy them. So Santa Ana it's a fairly decent sized city. I mean, they didn't have any like skyscrapers or anything like that. It's just very large. And my first area was kind of just on the outskirts of the city, just a really big neighborhood built by the government. And it's really cheap housing for people, that live there. And it's really interesting because it's all built the same. Like, we would often get lost because just all of the buildings looked the same usually. And there were a few landmarkers that differentiated it. And so that was definitely interesting, and just the housing and how everything looked the same. And you go into one house and it's exactly the same as the other one. And so that was definitely interesting, just to see just like the living conditions, at least in Santa Ana, parts of it. It was different because if you get into the center of the city is where more of the wealth is. And so you'd get to some really big houses. And when you got to those big houses, all of them had a really big wall around them. That was a really common thing, was just to see just a big wall with a big, slidable door that you can, put cars in and everything like that. And the transportation is, I would say, 95% bus. Everyone got around using the bus system. Since everyone used the buses, you definitely see every different type of people on the bus. The work there involves, the people that use the buses, it involves a lot of, selling things that they make or trade with. Sometimes people would make their own baskets or something like that and sell those. But I think the more common thing was, most of it was clothing. Sometimes it was food, a lot of fruit, stuff like that. So that's what that consisted of. They would just go and maybe sell in the street. Maybe they had a place where, they'd rent out or something like that. That was interesting to see. And so they'd always bring, their stuff on with them to, go wherever. And so like these big ginormous bags, like this little old lady with like a really big bag that they would carry on their head. That was a common thing of the women of El Salvador. They would just carry immense loads of whatever on their heads, and that's what it consisted of. They would go out and sell something, or actually it was pretty common to have a store in your actual home, where they would have anything from chips, just potato chips, to shampoo. And it was just like a little store that they would have whenever someone needed something really quick, they'd just go to the little corner store. They called them tienditas, which means little store, and you could just get anything. And they were everywhere, from block to block. So a lot of people do sell things on the bus. They would bring whatever thing that they could with them, and they just kind of walk along and just offer to sell something, and then just hop off. If they sold something or not, they'd hop off and get onto the next bus. That was something that people exclusively did, whether it was like candy, fruit, something like that. Would be very common. Some people, I remember once someone was selling one of those spirographs, where you draw and you can make cool pictures. And so just any sort of knick-knack or whatever you can think of, especially when the buses would drive through the actual market. And they had a big market set up where everyone would be selling everything, meats, fruits, things like that. And when they'd be driving through the market, which was usually by the bus terminal, so you'd be able to drive right through it. And they would always just, tons of people, 10, 20 people would just come on and just start shouting, what they were selling. and so it got really loud and just shouting what they're selling. Sometimes you had to look and see what you wanted. Maybe sometimes, and they would, you just make that transaction and be on your way. And so that was definitely interesting to see, just like people selling all these things. And sometimes you didn't even need to get off the bus to go to the market because it would come to you. And so that was definitely fun to see. As far as their taste goes, the taste, they like sour, but they also like bitter tasting foods. And I say that because of the fruit sometimes, and especially mangoes. Mangoes are there's tons of mangoes there, and I can get to the mangoes, but usually they would get, when the mangoes are early in season, when they're still green, they're fairly small, and they're just green, and they'd pick these mangoes and slice them in half, remove the seed, and you just eat them. They'd eat them usually with salt or with this chile sauce, and maybe sometimes with lime. And when I first saw that, I was weirded out, because why would you want to eat, some green fruit that normally, when it's ripe, it tastes, really sweet and delicious. And so I tried some, and I guess I have the same, like tastes as the people from El Salvador. I really like, sour, sometimes bitter foods, and it's very good. Just this green mango, and you just eat it with salt or with just this chili sauce, and I would get that all the time because it tasted so good. Those were delicious. And talking about mangoes, they also were very delicious ripe, of course. And usually in El Salvador, being a Central America, a pretty tropical climate, there would be many different types of fruits. Some that I've heard of and some that I hadn't. And of course the most common one would be mangoes. And the thing about the fruit trees there is that they just grow randomly. You throw a seed off on the side of the road and a mango tree will grow, which was very cool, because sometimes there'd be so many mangoes that they would fall from the trees and no one would pick them up because there'd be so many. They had different types. Some of them, they had some mangoes that were bigger, and the bigger ones, they were less sweet usually. And then they had smaller ones, which were maybe about this big, and and they were very sweet. And then there were some in between. So you could definitely, there was a different variety. I had no idea there were different types of mangoes. So that was definitely something that was cool, is that the different types of mangoes that you could eat and enjoy, lots of mangoes all the time. Sometimes you had to check for worms, you just bite in it and just see, maybe if there were worms, maybe if there weren't. Usually there weren't. Every once in a while you get lucky and have a worm, so some extra protein, I guess. And that was one big fruit. So about the food in El Salvador, it mainly consists of almost every meal of beans and rice, usually. And if not beans, or if not rice, then definitely beans. And so, get used to that. That's definitely something that you will eat a lot of. And I didn't have any problem with beans and rice before, but it grew on me. It definitely did. I enjoyed it a lot. And the food there it's a little bit different. There are some dishes that are really common to El Salvador. I mentioned the pupusas, and that was one thing. I guess I should probably first mention that the culture in El Salvador is, in contrast to our culture, we have breakfast and lunch, and usually dinner is I guess you could say, the big meal. I guess it's a little more, larger. Sometimes it's more fancy or something like that. Well, in El Salvador, the big thing is lunch. Lunch is usually their fancy meal, where they usually have more food or meats, stuff like that, and whereas dinner is kind of more along the lines of breakfast. So you have breakfast, and then they have the dinner, which are fairly closely related as far as types of food go. One of my favorite breakfast foods to eat would be plátanos fritos, which are fried plantains, and I think that's a common thing in Central America. We would often they'd just be plantains, if you don't know, plantains are just like like in the banana family, but they're a lot larger and pretty sweet. And they would fry them up and serve them with beans. Usually it's a very they usually put beans in a blender for a moment, like so they're kind of like liquefied a little bit, but still so they're like a little runny, and then with cream. That was a very common thing, and sometimes with maybe like a poached egg or something like that. And I have to say that was my favorite breakfast meal, right next to the pupusas. Were my favorite breakfast meal, and I'll get to the pupusas, but this meal was really great. And one thing about El Salvador also is that there is always something accommodating the meal. And when I say that, I mean it's either bread or tortillas. That's one thing that's interesting. And the tortillas there are about, you know, this big around, and they're pretty thick. They're thick tortillas, and usually they're used, you know, you eat them along with the meal, and you use it like to, you know, scoop up the rice into your utensils or to sop up any like food or anything like that. That's a very common thing. And if there aren't tortillas, like usually a lot of people won't eat. Like it's very interesting. Like it's just like, and the tortillas, where are they? Or the bread. I usually like to have bread with this specific meal of the plantains. And so you'd have the bread in one hand, you'd have your fork in the other, and you'd, you know, use it to help scoop up, you know, beans or rice or whatever onto your fork, and then you'd sop up some of the beans and eat it. And that was my favorite. I love that meal. I'd often have that for breakfast and for dinner. I thought that was great. And let's see, another meal. Well, I should definitely mention the pupusas, and that was very common. That was more common for breakfast and dinner. Usually lunch, a lot of the pupuserias is what they call them, the pupusa stores, they would close during lunchtime, because that was a weird thing to have pupusas at lunchtime, because it was seen as like a more casual type of meal. And they're basically these stuffed tortillas, you know, filled with the beans and everything like that. I mentioned those. And you can put, my favorite, what they did, they mixed up this chicken, and they put, I don't know exactly what they put in there, but they put other types of vegetables maybe in there, and they'd stuff them and, you know, make the pupusas, fry them up. You'd eat them with your hands, with your fingers, and you'd have to cover them with this salsa, and you just go at it with your fingers. And if you were to eat a pupusa with a fork and knife, everyone would look at you like you were crazy. And so that was interesting. That was fun. Just eating, you know, these pupusas with your hands. A very common food is just chicken with beans and rice. That was very common, whether it be just fried or just cooked chicken just on the skillet or whatever. And you know, I would eat chicken all the time, and tastes great. It really does. Like, I'm actually not that much of a picky eater, and so I would eat a lot of that. And I guess there was one time maybe when I got tired of, I was just like, oh, chicken again, you know. But it was still delicious, and that was a good meal to eat. And one meal that I really didn't like. I'm not a picky eater. I mean, I guess I would eat it, but I didn't like it, was that they would have fried fish. And I'm kind of particular on fish as far as, you know, my taste goes, but this is a little different in that they would get the entire fish, and they would, you know, take out just like the major organs, but they would get the entire fish, and they would fry the entire fish, and then they would slap it on your plate with some rice, and you just see just like this fish that had been fried, and you just be looking at it. It still had, like, you know, the outer skin on it and everything, and that was something that I didn't particularly love. And out of courtesy, I would of course eat it, and somehow once it came up that, you know, I didn't like the fish, and one of the person that was our cook, she would make it every once in a while, and she looked at me and she was like, well, why didn't you tell me? And I was like, I don't know, I didn't want to hurt your feelings or anything. And another dish that I didn't like was liver. I mean, it's not exclusive to El Salvador, but I had first tried it when I was there, would be liver, and I had a hard time swallowing that one. It was just like, your basic cow liver, and so I guess that's not all that unique, but those were the only ones that I didn't really like, but everything else I really enjoyed. I thought were really good. And some snack foods, one of my favorite was what's called the yucca root, and they would fry it. It's a root. Basically, it's very close to the potato, I think. And they would chop it up and they would fry it. So like these little pieces. Usually they're about that round, and they would fry them up, and then they would serve them with salsa. And usually, if you bought yuca on the streets, they would put it in a bag for you and tie the top of the bag. They pour the salsa in with the fried yuca, and they tie the top of the bag. And usually, you just bite off the end, like the corner end of one of the bags, and you just eat it straight from the bag, like kind of like squeeze it out, kind of a little bit like toothpaste. It sounds kind of gross, but it's actually really good. I guess the closest thing would be like fried potatoes with just kind of like a tomato sauce with some spices in it. It was delicious. Like we would get it all the time, just be chowing down. Like if you got hungry maybe a little bit while you were out there, you could definitely eat that. They would get the plantains, and they would slice them down the just long ways like this, and they would fry them. So they'd turn into like chips, plantain chips. I think that's pretty common. And they would serve them with what they called chile. And I was thinking, when I first saw it, it's like really red sauce, and they pour it on there. And I was thinking it was going to be really, really spicy. But Salvadoreños, they don't like spicy foods at all. Like it's something that it's just not common. Like I would rarely, if at all, come across anything really spicy. So that's like kind of like how their taste. They usually prefer very sour. So like they would always get lime, and especially with these plantain chips, they'd get that sauce. They'd get the chile sauce, and then they put lime, and they'd squeeze some limes in there, and you'd kind of like mix it around. It's still in the bag, the plastic bag, and then you could munch on those. Those were very delicious. Those were something that I really enjoyed. Another fruit that was one of my favorites was that I miss very much was what they call talpas. And they're these little green, they look like grapes, but they have like a thicker shell around them. It's just these little green fruits, and you can usually, like, just to open it, you just kind of like bite, and it like breaks it, and you can pop it open. And inside is just like this, just a fruit, and you can pop that into your mouth. And you just kind of gnaw on it around like the seed, and so the seed's fairly big, and so you can just like kind of suck on it and everything like that, and just spit out the seed. They were very sweet usually. Those were very delicious. I loved just to chow on those. Would be just those talpas. And it was interesting because in let's see, I believe in Santa Ana, I don't know if I might have those mixed up, but in Santa Ana they would call them talpas. And in Sonsonate, they would call them mamones. And so, and it just interesting to see just like the difference in what they call them. Like even though they were so close, they'd call that, because like I would say, oh, I'd want, like if I was in Sonsonate, I'd be like, oh, I want some talpas, and they'd be like, what? Don't you mean mamones? And oh yeah, mamones, yeah, So that was interesting, and they were a delicious fruit. They also had what were called lichas, which were a little bit bigger, same basic idea, a little bit bigger, but they had like these long, I guess you could say, spikes. I mean, they weren't sharp, but just like these spikes growing out of them, and they were red. And you could open them the same way and pop them open. And these, I think, were really common. Like they tasted a lot like coconut. They'd have the same seed and everything like that, but you can pop them in your mouth, and they taste a lot like just coconut. Like if you were to scoop, a coconut, some of the coconut meat or whatever, and eat that. And those were really good. Not as common, I don't think, but those were delicious. And speaking of the coconuts, there were coconuts all over the place. Really delicious coconuts. Oftentimes you could just buy a coconut, and they would just get their machete, and they'd chop it open, make a little opening for you, and then you could just drink right from the coconut. And that was good. My favorite was when it was chilled, when they were kind of cool. They were cold, and they would often be cold straight from the coconut, and you can just drink you can drink the coconut milk, and once you were done drinking it, sometimes they would chop it in half for you, and then you could just scoop out with a spoon. You can scoop out the actual, fruit from it and eat it. And at first I didn't particularly love it. I was like, it didn't really have any flavor, but every once in a while they sometimes would put a little bit of sugar in there to sweeten it. But it was really good, and it was very satisfying. They would just bring truckloads of just full of coconuts, and you could eat those all the time. They were always available. The fruit in general, I think, was sweeter. Like, I mean, they had, of course they had like watermelon and things like that. And you just bite into it and it'd be very sweet. And I think it's just because, it was very fertile, easy to grow there, and just a lot sweeter. When I came back here, I was a little disappointed. I bit into a banana, it wasn't as sweet, it was a little disappointing, but that was one thing. It was a very sweet fruit that they had down there. You eat a lot of fried foods in El Salvador, so you can definitely get used to that. They really enjoy frying stuff, and they have what's called empanadas. The empanadas in El Salvador were fairly small, and what they would do would be they would mash up plantains, and they'd mash up and they make like this kind of like dough out of it, kind of, not really a dough, but this kind of like paste, I guess you could say. And then they would separately they would make kind of like a vanilla, usually it was vanilla cream with a little bit of cinnamon, and they'd get actual cinnamon sticks and stick them in there and mix them in. So they'd make that separately, and so they would get the plantain paste kind of stuff, and they'd use their hands. They use their hands the same way they would make pupusas. So they, dig a hole in it, make it a little flat, dig a hole in it, and then they'd scoop up a spoonful of this and plop it in, and then seal it up and make it into like this little like ball, this little nugget thing, and then just fry it. And then they'd put sugar on it, and then you'd eat it, and it was very delicious biting into that. You taste the banana or the plantain, and then you taste this the vanilla. They just called it cream, but it was almost like a little bit like pudding, I would say, like vanilla pudding, and then there'd be like little bits of cinnamon in there. Very delicious, one of my favorite desserts.